Please be seated. I guess that time when Jesus ran through the temple with the whip turning over tables was not the only time he got angry. I mean, there was the fig tree too. What did the fig tree ever do? Nothing. That was the problem. That's why Jesus was mad. But anyway, here he is mad again, right? It's more subtle in this gospel story, but it's there. It says he looked at them with anger. You know, usually when people come to Jesus with, I don't want to say stupid questions, but I'm going to say stupid questions. Or some kind of question that they want an easy answer to, but actually has a difficult answer. He gives them some kind of witty response, right? He looks on them with compassion, which is kind of what he does in the first part of the gospel, right? They're wondering why he could possibly pick food on the Sabbath, and he says, well, look at the scriptures. There's actually precedent for this. But in the second part of the story, there's no words, right? Not from the people. They're just watching him to see what he's going to do, because they know what he's going to do, because he already told them that he doesn't care about the Sabbath. He cares more about healing and being present to people. But they're the rule followers, right? They represent not just the religious leaders of their day, not just the religious people, but any people who are so obsessed with rules and doing things the way they've always been in the right way that they don't see the need for healing and transformation that's right in front of them. And that made him mad, right? Their hardness of heart angered him. And so he'd asked them the question, is it wrong to do this? And they had no answer. And so he went forward and met the person who needed healing right there in that moment. Because what is most important to Jesus is not that we do everything the way it's always been done and follow all the rules, but that we show love and transformation to the people around us. There was an article in USA Today this last week because the Pew Research results have come out again. This is breaking news, I know, but less people are going to church. I know, you know that already. But they've done another round of research, so now I think it's more than a quarter of people identify as non-religious, and people who consider religion an important part or very important part of their lives has dropped 10% to now barely more than half of people in the United States, 52%. But again, you knew that. You may not have known those numbers, but you knew the trend. But what was interesting to me about this article, it was, I think, a sociology and a religion professor. They were talking about how if religion goes away, something is going to have to replace it, right? Because religion fulfills a part of society that is important, right? It connects us to our ancestors, to our heritage, to the culture and traditions that have been passed down through generations. It's a place for community in a world and culture where so many people are extremely, devastatingly lonely. And most significantly, and most interesting to me, it's one of the important foundations for civic society, right? People who are religious are more likely to do things like donate or volunteer with organizations that are important to them, as opposed to going online and screaming their opinion on social media. And that is kind of how we function as a society, right? Unfortunately, we're leaning more towards the screaming at each other on social media, part of way of doing things. But this article was saying that church and religious communities are one of the few places where people have different opinions, different ideas, different lifestyles, different whatever, and yet they still come together and know and love one another. And that foundation of relationships is important for civic society. For us to move forward with a common ground and a common plan to make our life and our worlds better, we need to know each other, even if we don't always agree. I loved the story of the call of Samuel, especially when I was a child. And of course, all these years later, standing here like this, we know why I laid in bed at night and practiced saying, "Speak, Lord, your servant listens." But I didn't know that then. And I thought it was a beautiful, moving story because I didn't know the next part, right? We usually stop right there, right? "Speak, Lord, your servant's listening." Oh, it's wonderful. I'll do whatever you say, God. I'm here for you. I want to serve you. And then God says, great. Go tell the person who raised you, right, who just 3 seconds ago helped you figure out how to answer God's call, that everything they've ever valued is going to be destroyed. And there's nothing they can do about it, no takebacks, right? It's over. His family, his legacy, no more of that. I don't know about you, but this is the point where I would say to God, could you just tell him? Do I have to do that? Do I have to go and give this person that I love news that I don't even want to be true, let alone that they want to hear? I think it's easy for us to see why less people come to church, right? People think that Christianity is judgmental and homophobic and hypocritical, and on many counts, they're not wrong, right? Certainly, maybe not for you individually, maybe not for us as a church, but the church on a whole, it's got a lot of that Pharisees who are so obsessed with the rules that they forget the people who need healing right in front of them vibe going on. But I also think that the reality is that the kind of community that church can be, that religious communities can offer, is hard, right? It's kind of easy to sit at home by yourself and type on the computer about why someone else is an idiot, right? It is much more difficult to listen to them, right? To try to see where they might be coming from. It is much more difficult to try to speak to their face about an opinion that you have or an experience that you have is different from what they've had. That kind of community is difficult. And so it might be easier just to sleep in on Sunday mornings and not have to have any kind of real conversations or real relationships or actually listen. Paul says that we are holiness in clay vessels, right? Sacred life in clay vessels. I love that metaphor, so beautiful. Of course, our challenge is that we get obsessed with the clay vessels, right? What's happening on the outside of other people, what's happening on the surface of our own lives, and we forget about that light that shines through the darkness. But we know the power that that light can have. We know what happens when people actually listen to God and listen to each other and find a way to be a different kind of community. I just read an article this last week about a survivor of Hiroshima, the bombing that happened during World War II, who dedicated his life to telling the stories of the Americans, prisoners of war, who died at Hiroshima. Isn't that fascinating? And it reminded me of so many other stories that I've heard, you know? I think about the people at the Charleston AME church who went and begged for forgiveness for the man who had come and opened fire in the middle of their Bible study. I think about people who've been wrongly convicted of crimes who then dedicated their lives to making sure that other people had justice, or people who've been rightly convicted of crimes who dedicated their lives to trying to make right what they had done wrong. There are so many stories of how transformation and healing happens when people are able to put themselves aside and see a bigger picture and see a bigger need for healing and reconciliation and forgiveness. And that is what the church is supposed to be doing, right? Because the reality is, as Paul talks about, we are all people of light, right? We are all beautifully and wonderfully made, and yet we live in a world where we don't always use those gifts to the best of our ability. We live in a world where there's conflict and pain and struggle. And our role as Christians is to take that pain and struggle and make it into some kind of power, into some kind of place for transformation. Healing is not just getting rid of what has broken, although that's a good start. It's about finding a way to turn brokenness into more life. It's about living with this paradox of what it is to be alive and beautifully, wonderfully made, but also know that there is pain and suffering and death in our life and in all lives. But what we do, or are trying to do anyway, is to turn towards the light, to remember what Jesus taught us, that love is of the utmost importance. It's more important than doing things the way they've always been done. It's more important than following every single rule exactly the way it's supposed to be followed. The number one rule of order, as it were, for Jesus was love. In the Episcopal tradition, there's something called via media, right? It means the middle way. I think in Latin, not a language person. But as you may know, the Episcopal Church was originally created to keep the Protestants and Catholics from killing each other, right? So the idea was, let's find a middle ground, let's worship together, and not worry about all the things we believe. But the reality is, it's a little deeper, the Via Media, than just not worrying about other people's opinions. Because Frederica Harris Thompson said, the Via Media means we walk together, right? The middle way is the way we go. And that means that if we're struggling, if we're angry, if we're hurting, if we're joyous, if we have a difference of opinion from somebody around us, we walk together. That is the gift of faith communities and of St. Stephen's in our lives. Because it reminds us that the most important thing to Jesus was the people right in front of him. And the most important thing to us is how we can walk in his way of love. And we can only do that if we listen not just to God, but to each other.